Hello, everybody. Today, we're going to talk very quickly about feature leads. Now, I know we already talked about feature story structure a little bit earlier on in the semester, but because feature leads are sort of the defining factor of features, I figured I would uh, just build a full lesson around it. Also, as a heads up, this is going to sound very similar to a conversation you've likely already had in feature reporting if you are in that course with Dr. Cowart. Okay. Do remember that your sports feature assignment is due May 6th by 5 p.m. So you want to be at this point at the stage where you've done most of your interviewing and you want to be able to start typing it together into a story. Feature stories, as you can recall from that first conversation we had on them, what seems like forever ago, it was actually just about a month ago. It was one of the last things we did before we left. Feature stories follow a rough structure. You start with your feature lead, which is what we're talking about today. Then you have your nut graph, which we're going to talk about also a little bit today. Your first quote, which introduces people into the rest of the story. The body copy, which is one of the things that we spent a little bit of time earlier in the semester talking about, but the idea that your feature stories are mostly in the middle of them built out of anecdote, which are series of smaller stories that are put together to tell a longer story. And then finally, the kicker, where you bring everything back together to the lead, which we'll talk about at the end of the presentation today. Okay, the feature lead is the defining ingredient in a feature story. Like, it is the thing that makes a feature story most identifiable and most different from a traditional hard news story that is who, what, when, and where in its lead. And remember what the point of a feature lead is. Unlike a traditional standard news lead, which has got your who, what, when, and where the purpose is to tell the reader exactly what it is they're about to read, instead, the feature lead is designed to lure the reader into the story. It strives to make them feel connected to the story and to make them want to read more of the story, to not just skim it, but to really read it and understand it. And that puts a lot of pressure on you to come up with a lead for a story like that. It's much harder to be entertaining than it is to be informative. Sorry about that. A feature lead by design does not tell the reader what the story is actually about. As a matter of fact, you're going to almost go out of your way to not tell the reader exactly what the story is about. And the reason you're going to do that is because it builds suspense. By giving them something interesting or entertaining or dramatic or funny in the lead, we hook them in through a sense of suspense to get them to want to find out what the story is really about, what the point is, what the lesson is. And in feature stories, there's essentially three things you can write about if you really want to distill everything down. As we think about what it is we want to put in this lead, we can focus on the people involved. We can focus on the actions that people are doing, and we can focus on the setting in which they exist. And all the examples we'll look at today as a part of this presentation involve using some ratio of these three things as one of the key points. Also, I don't think I put a slide in this explicitly saying it, but just so you know, a feature lead can be more than one sentence, whereas your standard lead that you'd put on a recap story or a preview story would need to only be one sentence. So these leads can be a little longer. The thing that makes a feature lead challenging is that it gives you freedom, where as a lot of the times when you're working on a recap story, and I've talked about how you could almost build it off of a template, right? It's almost like playing Mad Libs. It is insert team name here, insert score here, insert win or loss here, right? It all sort of follows a template. Whereas the feature lead is more like giving you a sketchbook and asking you to draw something. It's much more challenging. Okay, let's build our hypothetical examples around a runner, someone who is training for a marathon, let's say. So the hard news lead might say something like this. Statesboro resident Tina Smith is training to compete in her first marathon, the Southern Discomfort Marathon in Calhoun on May 25th. The feature lead, however, might say something like this. Tina Smith ties her running shoes, finishes the last of the water in the gallon jug she was carrying around, and stares at the track. She'll run around it 104 times before her morning is through. Now notice the lead doesn't actually tell the reader what the story is about. Who is this person? Why are we paying attention to them? You spend the rest of a feature story telling the reader who they are and why you should be paying attention to them. The lead is only designed to grab attention. There's a million ways to write a feature lead, but if you ever feel stuck, there's three main genres of feature lead. These are things to try if everything else you've tried just doesn't quite work. The first one is the descriptive lead, and this is the one where you're going to give a lot of specific tiny details, usually about a person or about a setting, and usually less so about an action. But an example of the descriptive lead might be something like this. It's 6:30 a.m., the grass is still covered in dew, it's chilly out, there's no students around. Tina Smith is stretching in the bleachers near the track at the Statesboro High School. She's wearing running shoes, warm-up pants, and a hoodie. She hops down and stares at the quarter-mile track with a steely gaze. It's go time. Notice the defining factor of the descriptive lead is lots of details, lots of small little elements that the goal is for us to be able to close our eyes and almost picture this scene, right? So we can say that the grass is still covered in dew. We can picture that. We know what that's like. There's no students around. It's an empty track area. We can picture that. We have description of what she's doing, right? She's stretching near the bleachers, or in the bleachers near the track. We have what she's wearing. She's got running shoes. She's got warm-up pants. She's got a hoodie on, right? It is lots of little details so that we can imagine it in the theater of our brain. There's also the anecdotal lead. This is another one to try. This one starts with a story within a story. So if you've got some really super compelling little tiny story within the larger story that is your feature, you can do something like this. Training hasn't been easy for Statesboro resident Tina Smith. The first time she tried to run, even just for a few miles, she ended up with blisters covering her feet and painful shin splints. Turns out she had the wrong kind of shoes for her running style. At the time, she didn't even know there were different kinds of running shoes or running styles. So it is an anecdote, right? It is this person who is trying to run their first marathon, and the anecdote is them discovering that, oh, dang, there's different kinds of running, and there's different kinds of running shoes. There's not tons of detail in this one like there was in the descriptive lead. Instead, what we are trading in is story and process and beginning and end. This one usually works pretty well if you have good action, whereas the descriptive lead works a little better if you have a really compelling person or a really compelling setting. The anecdotal lead works well if you have a really compelling action. And last but not least is the narrative lead. And these rely on the perspective of a source that fits within this same theme of the story. So what you are doing with the narrative lead is giving the reader the opinion or the thought process of the subject, of the person. This one works really well for personality profiles, and it works really well when you have a really interesting person that you are writing about, and they are a good quote, or they're very detailed or very interesting in how they speak. They're a really good interview. Narratives usually work well with good interviews. So an example would be something like this. The first time she tried running the full 26.2 miles during practice, she was in a lot of pain. Her feet hurt, her knees hurt, her hips hurt, somehow even her arms hurt. It didn't matter. Finally finishing a full-length practice run was the best feeling Statesboro resident Tina Smith has ever felt. So one of the defining factors of the narrative lead is it tells us how the source is feeling. In this case, it's us asking the source how they felt after their first practice run. We, as the reporter, may not be there the moment that she finishes her first practice run. So what we have to do as reporters is ask her how she felt. That's the key element of a narrative lead, is we're asking the source how they feel. What are they thinking? What's going through their mind? When we get answers from those questions, we can shape them in the form of a narrative lead. Now, those are the big three, but there are plenty of other different kinds of feature leads we can play around with. There's the contrast lead. Some people make New Year's resolutions to lose weight, to quit smoking, or to learn a new skill. Statesboro resident Tina Smith described hers was simple, run 26.2 miles. It's comparing and contrasting one thing with something else. So it is saying a lot of people have these very common New Year's resolutions for our person that we were profiling, they had a very specific one. So it's compare and contrast. Those can work pretty well sometimes. But I do want to give you a handful of different kinds of feature leads that people try to use sometimes, but are always pretty terrible. Give yourself plenty of time to really think about the kind of lead you want for your story. Don't just slap something on the story. Almost all of these bad feature leads are the result of people hurrying the process, of not giving themselves enough time to really sit and think about how they're going to begin their story. So first we've got our essay leads. These are just boring. These are just absolutely boring as sin. Something like a marathon is a race that lasts 26.2 miles and is named after the ancient Greek Battle of Marathon. If your lead sounds like it has been taken from Wikipedia, it's probably a bad lead. It's just dull. It's boring. There's no life to it. If the goal is to lure people in and make them want to read the story, an essay lead is not going to do that. It's not an essay you're writing. It's supposed to be creative and entertaining. It's supposed to have a hook to it. I'm not going to bother reading it all out, but there's the cluttered lead. Cluttered leads are what happens a lot of the times when people new to feature writing sit down and try to write a feature lead, and they come up with about 6 or 7 different half ideas, but instead of seeing those out fully, they just put all of the half ideas together, hoping that it makes a whole idea, and it never really does. It just ends up sounding rambly and long-winded. It's also just really shocking. Like when you see a story that starts with a giant paragraph, a lot of readers aren't going to read it. They're just going to pass on it and move something else, move to another story. The biggest fix, if you find yourself having done written a cluttered lead, is to take out your eraser, hypothetical eraser, and just see how much stuff you can get rid of out of that lead and still have a viable lead. That's a good practice for those. Avoid crystal ball leads. This is something that sounds like Statesboro resident Tina Smith could never have imagined she'd be 1 month away from competing in her first marathon. The problem with them is that most people don't dream about the things that will happen to them. That's not how that works. So they're just very template, very boilerplate. And you could use the same lead on nearly any story and it would work. Weather leads. It was 72 degrees Fahrenheit and slightly overcast while Statesboro resident Tina Smith laced up her shoes for another practice run. The problem with these is that the weather almost never has anything to do with anything, and therefore you should avoid it as a cliche lead, unless it does have something to do with the weather. So if one of the things that you want to start your story off with is something like this: it was pouring rain while Statesboro resident Tina Smith laced up her shoes for another practice run. She was still going to practice. It could rain during her race after all. In that case, the weather has to do with the story, so that's fine. Just don't fall back on weather. And the big problem with those three, or the last 2 to 3 of these leads, is that they're template, they're boilerplate. They're like putting letterhead on the top of documents. It's the same thing throughout. You could take that exact same kind of lead and slap it on any feature story, and it would still work. And that's not good. You want your feature story to sound unique, and the only way to do that is to have a unique, interesting approach to how you construct that lead. There's the workday lead. I hate these too. It was just a normal day for Statesboro resident Tina Smith. The problem with these is that if it was actually just a normal day, he or she would not be interesting enough to write a story about. And last but not least, an important reminder on this topic, which is once you have lured the reader in with your lead, you then need to tell them exactly what that story is going to be about. This is where our nut graph comes into play. A nut graph is the term for the paragraph that comes right after the feature lead and tells the reader exactly what the story is. It sums the story up in a nutshell. It is a single sentence, 1 sentence paragraph that clearly and cleanly explains the who, what, when, and where of the story. And I will be looking for those in your stories very specifically. The first time she tried running the full 26.2 miles during practice, she was in a lot of pain. Her feet hurt, her knees hurt, her hips hurt, somehow even her arms hurt. It didn't matter. Finally, finishing a full-length practice run was the best feeling Stage Pro resident Tina Smith had ever felt. There's our feature lead. Boom, we like it. Right after the reader reads this lead, we need to tell them exactly what this story is about. And the way we do that is with a nut graph, and we say, Smith is training to compete in her first marathon, the Southern Discomfort Marathon in Calhoun on May 25th. Now note, the nut graph sounds an awful lot like a hard news lead, a who, what, when, where lead. Other than the fact that we don't have to worry about delayed identification, we can treat a nut graph almost exactly like a hard news lead. As a matter of fact, as an experiment, a lot of feature writers will take their hand and actually cover up their screen and try to start the story or read the story just as if it started with the nut graph. And they'll ask themselves, does the reader have enough information to know what the story is going to be? If the answer is no, you need to go back and retool the nut graph. If the answer is yes, good. You've written a good nut graph. And just so you know, the process of writing a good feature lead does take a few tries. Very rarely will you ever nail it perfectly exactly on the first go. You sort of have to approach it like you're painting. You add a little bit here, you add a little bit there. You sort of see how it fits you, what you've added, what you've taken away. It's important to remember, this is not a single shot thing. You're going to want to give yourself time to think about this. And there's plenty of examples of feature leads that I will post to the Folio site over the next couple days to give you some examples of feature stories and feature leads. This is one of the examples. You can pause the video and read it if you'd like to. Another one that I'll post is a really good feature story on Colin Kaepernick from a couple years ago, from 2017. And it starts off with a really nice narrative lead where the reporter wasn't with Colin Kaepernick, but the reporter reached out and talked about and asked him the sort of what he was feeling. And so there's a couple examples going along with this that I will post to the Folio site. But that is pretty much it for today. If you find yourself struggling with the feature story and how to start it, feel free to ask me via email, and I will help you out coming up with a good way to start your story. My suggestion would be to try to come up with something and then ask me if I like that. That will be much more of an efficient use of our time versus like, help, I can't think of anything. I bet you can think of something. So think of something and then ask me if I like it or not. Okay, with that, see y'all next time.